Hello, my name is Elby. In this presentation, I will give you an overview of the process for submitting an IRB for exempt research at Colorado State University, Pueblo. An exempt research designation means that the research qualifies as no risk or as minimal risk to research participants and is exempt from most of the requirements of the federal policy for the protection of human subjects. Exempt research is still considered research and therefore requires an IRB for review and determination of exemption. Examples of exempt categories include research in commonly accepted educational settings, research that only includes interactions involving educational tests, and research that only includes benign behavioral interventions. For more information about the specific categories for exemption, you can go to subpart A of 45 CFR Part 46. You can easily obtain this document by doing a quick internet search for the 2018 Common Rule. We use Kuali to manage the submission and review of IRB applications. You can access the login to Kuali from the Colorado State University Pueblo website, IRB website. Just clicking here on the Log into Kuali button, you will be asked to authenticate using Duo. Once in Kuali, you'll see a list of any protocols that you have started, either active or in process. You can see here that I have 3 protocols in progress. To create a new IRB application, click on this New Protocol button here in the top right corner. The first thing that you will be asked to do is enter the information of the principal investigator for the research. Remember, Kuali does not allow for co-principal investigators, co-PIs. There will be one person who acts as principal investigator, and then if you are collaborating with other researchers, they will be added later and listed as either co-researchers or key personnel depending on their role in the research. I'm entering my last name here and the information auto-populates. You can see that I'm listed in the system by my legal name, not by my preferred name. And then you also can see my CSU Pueblo email address populating. Selecting my name here will auto-populate the lead unit section. If for some reason the lead unit does not auto-populate, or if it populates incorrectly, please reach out to us at the IRB using our email address, csup_irb@csupueblo.edu. It's really important that you select the correct campus, PB or Pueblo, because otherwise your IRB application is going to be sent to Fort Collins. Fort Collins does not have the authority to review and approve IRBs from CSU Pueblo employees. So make sure that it is populating with the PB or Pueblo as the lead unit. The last thing that you do on this page is name your project. Try to strike a balance between descriptive of your research and also concise. The Kuali protocol system is designed using conditional input. Essentially, this means that you're only going to see the fields that are relevant to your research, which is going to be based on the way that you answer the general questionnaire. This is the point at which conditional input begins. In this screencast, I'm only describing the process for the exempt template. I'm going to post other screencasts that walk through the expedited or limited and full board processes. So on this screen then, for the exempt research, you're going to select here this button next to exempt and then click next. Now you see a list of screening questions has populated. You're going to scroll through and answer these questions based on your research question and your research design. How you answer these screening questions will determine the fields that populate to your IRB application. So read through and answer each of these questions with your research project, your research question in mind, and then select Next. Now you've entered the full protocol where you'll start to answer questions and enter information about your research. The first step is adding all research personnel. Anybody who's going to participate in data collection, anybody who's going to have access to the data needs to be included in this section. So let's say I'm collaborating on this research with a co-investigator who also works here at CSU Pueblo. To add this person, I'm going to click here on the Add Line. And now an additional protocol personnel window has popped up. I'm going to search for my co-investigator's name and home unit here. I enter my co-investigator's name here, and then I search for her department, which is teacher education at Pueblo, so PB as the home unit. Now, if I wanted to swap roles here, I could list Vicky, my co-investigator, as the PI and change my role to co-I. I'm just going to list her here as co-I, co-investigator. I also need to indicate which study procedures or activities my co-investigator will participate in and provide a brief description of those study procedures. I've indicated that she'll be administering surveys and participating in focus groups. You can see I've also granted Vicky full access to the protocol, which means that she is able to log into Koala using her own credentials and collaborate on this IRB application. If I were to select read only, she would be able to see the work that I'm doing, but she would not be able to contribute or edit anything directly. The last thing that I need to do for the personnel section is to upload evidence of ethics training for all research personnel. I do this by selecting the Add Info button here. After selecting the Add Info button, an add box pops up and you can drag and drop or select a file from your desktop. I'm going to select the Choose button here and find the file on my desktop. I then select the city training or ethics training for my co-investigator and hit Open. And here I name the attachment. This serves as a label for the IRB reviewer to quickly access the necessary document. You'll also select one of the attachment type labels from this drop-down list, and optionally, you might add a comment. Once you've completed these steps, select Done. So you can see here that we've successfully uploaded the city certificate for Dr. Boley. Remember, though, that you need ethics training certificates for all study personnel. So I need to follow these same steps to upload my own city certification. To do so, I would click on the Edit button next to my name here, and then proceed through the steps I just outlined to attach my own city training certification. If you're collaborating on your research with colleagues external to CSU Pueblo, you can add them here. Examples for people you might add in this section include faculty at another university or a co-investigator who works in the community or at a local school district, for example. You add them in the same way I demonstrated above. Click that Add Info button here, Add Info button here, and fill out the necessary information. If you have multiple external collaborators, you can add more simply by clicking the Add Line button and then entering their information. Once you've completed the people section, you'll move on to the general questionnaire. This is actually what you filled out when you opened the protocol. So you can access it here if you need to make any changes. For example, maybe you selected that you're not receiving funding, but ended up applying for a research grant. You could make those changes to the general questionnaire so that the appropriate fields populate in the application. I'm not actually going to make any changes to the general questionnaire, and instead of scrolling, I'm just going to select study participants here to jump to the next section. In the study participant section, we need to ensure that principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice are being applied. Part of this includes identifying who your participants are and indicating if any of those participants that you're specifically targeting for your research belong to vulnerable populations. Of course, if you are targeting participants from multiple vulnerable populations, you can add more lines as needed. So to start this process, click here on Add Info. Select this drop-down list and then scroll through and select the specific target population. The collaborators section is important because collaborators are different than external personnel. Of course, the difference being the research relationship. If I have, for example, a co-investigator at Mesa State University, they are considered external personnel. However, if I'm collecting data from multiple universities, but I'm not working with a specific co-researcher from those universities, then I have research collaborators. The difference boils down to the responsibilities of the collaborator or the co-investigator and the access that they have or do not have to the data. In this hypothetical scenario, I have a survey that I'll be distributing at 3 universities, CSU Pueblo, CU Boulder, and New Mexico Highlands. My collaborators will administer the survey, but they're not screening or consenting participants, and they don't have access to identifiable private information. So I'm entering them as collaborators and not external personnel. Please note that we cannot initiate a reliance agreement for exempt research. A reliance agreement essentially says that one institution is in charge of oversight for the research at all research sites. This is necessary for research across multiple collaborating institutions, depending on the design of the research and also if the research is more than minimal risk. So if the collaborating institutions need IRB approval and your research has been designated and approved as exempt, those collaborating institutions will need to submit separate IRB applications at their respective institutions. If you find yourself in this situation, reach out to us at the IRB so that we can talk through your specific situation and ensure that we have the correct procedures in place. The next section is funding information. If you have a state or federal grant, select this Add Info button. It's going to bring up a list of state and federal funding agencies that kind of auto-populate. So select that Add Info button. And now this add box, this dialog box comes up and you select whether it's, federal, industry, or other, state or local. I'm selecting federal government for this example. And then you can see this just enormous list of potential funding sources. You can here where it says please select your funding source, you can actually type in the name of your the source of your federal grant, and it will jump to that section, so you don't have to scroll down to the W's, for example. The other funding sources include things like the Provost Office seed grants is a common funding source here at CSU Pueblo. So if you don't have any funding whatsoever, this field has only populated because I selected that I do have funding under the general questionnaire. If you don't have funding, don't worry about it. It's not even going to show up as long as you answer the question appropriately in the general questionnaire section of your application. And here is where we get into the nitty-gritty of describing the research. So you'll need to provide a concise description of your project in lay language. No scientific jargon here, and make sure to include your specific research question. You may also provide a proposed end date, like how long do you anticipate data collection to take? This information will help the IRB in following up with exempt research projects. The background section asks for information that will be helpful in assessing risk to participants. You'll provide relevant background, what is already known about your research questions, appropriate literature, your reasons or rationale for conducting the research. You'll also describe relevant expertise that you have or that you have access to that prepares you to conduct the research. If you're collaborating on this research with co-investigators, make sure to also list their relevant background, experience, and training, and indicate who has which background, who has which experience and training. You will also list your knowledge of community and cultural norms that are important to consider in carrying out your research. In the procedures section of the protocol, you will add a line for each specific procedure that will take place in your study. Let's say for this research that I'm using a general survey questionnaire for demographic information, individual interviews like one-on-ones, and focus groups. And then that I also plan follow-up with key participants. This means that I will need 4 entries under procedures, which I will create by clicking on this Add Line button. To add information for each planned procedure, select the Edit button and fill out the required fields for each procedure. For each of the procedures, you'll need to categorize them as research activities or other procedures and as experimental or established practice. This does not include recruitment or consent procedures. Information for recruitment and consent will be entered in a separate section later in the protocol. You'll need to provide a brief description of how data are captured and also disclose whether video or audio recording or photography are going to be used. Go through these steps for each procedure that you plan to use in your research. These questions here are populating because I indicated in the general questionnaire that I am recruiting university students for my research. If you're not enrolling students as part of your participant pool, these questions are not going to populate to your protocol. That being said, if you are including other potentially vulnerable populations in your research, you will need to answer other questions about how you plan to protect members of those vulnerable populations and how you plan to mitigate risk. Under privacy and confidentiality, you are going to explain how you will protect participants' privacy and how you will keep data confidential. In the student data and education research section, again, these questions are only pertinent to research with students. So depending on the research population you identify in the general questionnaire, you need to provide different information about how you will interact with your participants. In the participant population section, you will identify your population and how you plan to select participants from that population. How many total participants will be enrolled and at which sites if you are a multi-site study, inclusion and exclusion criteria, etc. In the recruitment section, you will describe your plan for identifying potential participants, or if you're using pre-existing data, how you plan to request access to those materials. You will also need to address issues of potential for participants feeling coerced or feeling an undue influence to participate. The little blue question marks here provide definitions of coercion and undue influence. So you can click on those and a window will pop up with those definitions. You also need to provide a description of your plan to mitigate any risk identified. For each planned recruitment activity, you'll describe the process on its own line. Add new lines for additional recruitment procedures, and then edit the recruitment procedures here. Remember to provide descriptors, planned subject ID methods, complete responses here so that IRB reviewers have a clear picture of the recruitment activities that you plan to engage in. So you are describing each planned recruitment activity on its own line. Add new lines for additional recruitment procedures, answer each of these questions, you'll scroll for more, and remember that everything that you plan to use for recruitment, like flyers or the language that you're going to use for email communication or social media posts, everything that you're using for recruitment needs to be uploaded to the attachment section at the end of the application. If you plan to compensate participants, you need to list and describe that here, including the plan for remuneration or how and when participants will be compensated. Be really specific here, including things like will compensation be prorated depending on the number of research interactions that your participant has. If participants will incur any cost to participate in your research, you need to disclose that here also. Selecting yes here opens up a dialog box where you need to explain the costs that will be incurred, and a reminder that this information also needs to be added to the consent form. In the risks and benefits section, you need to disclose all physical, psychological, economic, and social risks associated with your research. If your research meets qualification for minimal risk, it is eligible for exempt or sometimes expedited review. Minimal risk means that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. So in this section, you need to clearly identify potential risk couched in these terms within this definition of risk. If the IRB determines your research to be greater than minimal risk, you will also need to submit a written protocol, and your proposal will then be reviewed by the full IRB board. If you select, say, yes to risk to physical well-being, a dialog box opens for you to describe that risk. Here at the end of the risk and benefits section, you can see fields where you will describe how the benefits of the research justify the risks that you identified, as well as any direct and indirect research benefits. Under data management plans, you need to describe your plan for how you will collect, store, share, de-identify, and destroy data as appropriate. Note that only the research team should have access to the data that is collected for your study, and that as PI, you are responsible for managing security of the data and access to that data. If anyone is going to have access to the data, they need to be added to the protocol as research personnel under the people section. So describe here how data will be stored and backed up during the research. Describe how you're going to share the data. This is particularly important when you are collaborating with other researchers who do not have access to our secure data management systems, like OneDrive, for example. Will any identifiable data collected as part of your research be released in its identifiable form? If you select yes to this question, you need to explain what identifiable information you intend to release and how. And you will also need to include appropriate statements about these plans in your consent documents. And here you need to describe your long-term plans for preserving the resulting data set. You are not required to share your data set to the repository, so you can select no here. But if you select yes, you will be asked to describe your plan for data sharing. And here we are in the informed consent section. Your informed consent documents need to present potential research participants with key elements of your study, like enough information so that the participants understand what they are being asked to do, what they're being asked to be involved with before they decide whether or not to participate. The default process for informed consent is a signed form, but this is not always the right fit for every research endeavor. The IRB can approve alterations to what information is included. We can waive the requirement for signatures. In some cases, we can even waive the requirement for informed consent altogether if the request meets specific criteria. In this section, you will describe your consent process and also provide justification for any alteration or request for a waiver to the consent process. In the attachments section, you need to upload all relevant documents for your research. This includes recruitment information, consent and assent forms, letters of cooperation from community agencies or collaborating institutions, grant contracts or funding information if applicable, surveys or questionnaires, links to online surveys or QR codes that are going to be used in your research, questions for interviews or focus groups, conflict of interest disclosures. There are a lot of options that can be uploaded in this section. So you'll click, my picture is hiding it. You'll click Add Line and then Add Info to attach and describe each of the documents uploaded in this section. Not everything on this drop-down list is going to be relevant to your research, but do make sure to include all relevant documents. And then you can see here that there's no attachment yet. So you need to click on this edit button to provide more information and actually upload the document. When you click on that edit button, you can then provide a name for the document, for the attachment. In this hypothetical research, I'm conducting both one-on-one and focus group interviews. So I will need separate consent forms for each phase of my research. Now, providing a name for the document helps the reviewers really quickly identify the correct element for review. Once you have attached and named your document, select Done, and then proceed through these steps with your other file uploads. You can also see on this screen an alert indicating that I'm missing a document. In the general questionnaire, I had indicated that I'm receiving grant funding, so I am therefore required to upload a copy of the funding agreement as an attachment. And the other thing to note here is that only 5 of my boxes, or of my sections of the protocol, have a green check mark. And this is because I entered information in these sections, but they're still missing information in the other sections. Until all of these sections of the protocol have a green check mark, you are unable to submit your protocol. When you have completed all sections of the IRB application, you can then select the Submit button here on the right side of the screen. This will send your application to the CSU Pueblo IRB for review. If we need more information or clarification in any section of the application, we will indicate what is needed as an action item, and we will return the protocol to you for revision. In general, complete exempt protocols are reviewed and approved within about 7 days. Incomplete protocols may take more time for revision and updates. Please reach out to the IRB if you have questions. We are happy to support you in your research endeavors at CSU Pueblo. And thank you for your time in reviewing this video. We look forward to reviewing your IRB applications.